Allison. I'm a reading specialist and I have a website about literacy called Learning at the Primary Pond. And tonight I'm going live to tackle the question, are spelling tests good or bad? And that's a question that I get sometimes from teachers who are wondering about this. They may have been told that spelling tests are bad and they shouldn't be doing them, and there's some confusion around that. Or they may have been told that they have to give a spelling test. And so that's the question we're going to explore. If you're joining me, I would love for you to say hi, let me know what grade you teach, and I'd also love to know your thoughts. But actually, I said we're going to explore the question, are spelling tests good or bad? And I actually want to take that question off the table, because I don't think that that's the right question to be asking at all. Because spelling tests in themselves are just a way of assessing spelling, right? We teach kids to spell so that they can spell words correctly in their writing. And so we might be able to assess their spelling in their writing, but there's a lot of things that get mixed up in that. When a child is writing, they're not only thinking about spelling, a young child we're talking about. I'm talking mostly about primary, as I typically do. But when a child is writing, they're thinking about what they want to say, they're thinking about punctuation, they're thinking about maybe spacing or even letter formation. So there's a lot of stuff going on in their brain that may result in their spelling not always being spot on. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that a spelling test in and of itself is just an assessment. And I don't know about you, but I do need to know how my students are doing with their spelling. Spelling, let me pause on this and we'll come back to these other questions. Spelling is the process of encoding, right? When kids are decoding words, they are reading them, and spelling is encoding. So taking what they know about phonics and all that other stuff and actually putting letters on the page. That's what spelling is. So I need to see how my students are doing with that. So instead of asking, are spelling tests good or bad, there's some other questions that I want to talk to you about tonight. Questions that I think are a little bit more beneficial than asking if spelling tests in general are good or bad. Because honestly, it depends. A spelling test is just an assessment of words that a child should supposedly know how to spell, or maybe it's a pre-test. We want to see if they know how to spell them yet. But I think some better questions to ask are you teaching phonics patterns that can be generalized? We're going to go more in depth on these in a minute. Are you differentiating within reason the words that kids are learning in the first place? Do your practice activities that you're giving your kids for spelling or phonics, do they go beyond rote memorization? And then another question to think about is, are you incorporating frequent review? That's something else to think about. So these are the questions that we're going to talk about tonight. Again, instead of are spelling tests good or bad? Because inherently it's just an assessment, right? So I feel like, and I'd love to hear your opinion, I feel like there's no right answer to this question. I think we have to dig a little bit deeper. So we already talked about the fact that spelling is the encoding process. And I want to talk about a few things that go into a child's spelling ability, or whether they can or cannot spell a given word. So one thing that goes into a child's ability to spell a word is their phonics knowledge. Do they know the letters that make up the sounds that are in that word? Another thing that goes in is memorization. There is an aspect of there is an aspect of memorization to spelling. Now we need to go beyond that, as we'll talk about in a minute. But if you think about the word feet, right? It could be feet, like my feet, or it could be like feet. That was a great and amazing feat. And unless there's some obscure rule that I don't know about, and I'm not sure that it would be necessary to teach kids this, I just had to memorize that feet like my feet is spelled F-E-E-T, whereas feet like a great feat, that's spelled F-E-A-T. That's just something I memorized, right? Like learning the phonics patterns of E-E and E-A, that's necessary too, but I just had to memorize that those homophones, I think they are, how they're spelled, right? And that they mean different things. So there is an aspect of memorization. It's not all straight learning phonics patterns. Another thing that goes into it, especially as kids get a little bit older, this maybe goes beyond primary or maybe like second grade, although there are some very simple morphemes, but morphology knowledge. So if you think about the words photograph or photosynthesis, if a child is trying to spell that and they don't know the morpheme photo, which means light, I believe, they may not know to use the PH, right? When it comes to phonics, we could spell that with an F in theory, but if they know this morpheme photo, then that will help them spell photosynthesis. That will help them spell photograph. So there is some morphology knowledge necessary. And if we're thinking about simpler words, it even applies to words that end with like ed. Knowing that ending, because it can sound like t, it can sound like d, it can sound like id, right? So morphemes like photo and ed, knowing some of that also goes into spelling ability. So there's a lot going on, right? It's not necessarily straightforward. Like, yes, kids need to learn phonics and phonics patterns. There's some memorization, but there's also some morphology knowledge. And this brings into meaning, right? Like learning that photo means light. That's even some vocabulary. So let's come back to our alternative questions. Instead of asking, are spelling tests good or bad, one thing we want to ask ourselves is, are we teaching phonics patterns that can be generalized? If you think about the number of words that there are in English, it makes no sense to ask our kids to memorize each one. And I don't think any of us are doing that, right? But if we're giving our kids at the beginning of the week a list of spelling words, and there either is no commonality between the spelling words or there's too many patterns within the spelling words, we're basically asking them to memorize. And what happens with many kids, research shows, is that they will memorize for the week and then they may do well in their spelling test and then they will promptly forget them. Not all kids, but many kids. And so one way we can try to get around that or not do that is by teaching phonics patterns. Like when I was talking about the words feet and feet, the EE and the EA, those are patterns that apply to more than one word, right? So when we teach those patterns, we can get kids to spell more than just the word feet, right? They can spell the word beat and all kinds of other words. We have to teach them to generalize that, but it's something that we need to do because otherwise we're really asking them to memorize every single word in the English language individually, and that's just not realistic. So I think what I like to do to teach phonics patterns is when I have a list of words that the kids are working with, there needs to be either one or two phonics patterns that those words follow. They're not just random words. They're not necessarily content words, even though, that can be valuable to learn that and tie in science and social studies words as well. But I want there to be some rhyme or reason to what I'm teaching them. And I want to show them, hey, if you can spell feet, then you can spell feel, and you can spell all these other things, right? Another question I ask myself is, am I differentiating within reason? So there's also research that indicates that if we are teaching all of our kids in our class, assuming that we have a range of students, right? Unless they're, we're not talking about a class that's very similar in their spelling abilities. But if we're teaching them all the same words, that's not necessarily moving all our kids forward, because some kids may be lower than that and some kids may be higher than that. Now, your students may be all over the place, and maybe you do a spelling inventory like Words Their Way, and you end up with kids at like 10 different levels, or whatever your assessment results are. Now, it's not reasonable that we are teaching different words let's say you have 10 different spelling levels. It's not reasonable to teach 10 different spelling lists, to work on 10 different spelling lists with all those kids per se, because you can't necessarily have enough time to provide good instruction. But maybe you have 3 spelling groups, or maybe you have 2 spelling groups in your classroom so that you can really work on the patterns that those kids need to learn. And again, we want to do this within reason. It needs to be manageable because we can't, there's only one of us and there's so many kids. But if we can, at least break our class into 2 or 3 groups, then we can differentiate. We can make spelling more valuable for them because kids are working on exactly what they need to work on. Another thing I consider is, are my practice activities going beyond memorization? Am I just giving kids different colored markers and saying like, copy, all these words 10 times? That doesn't always lend itself to the kids actually learning the words. But what if maybe they're copying their words into a divided list where some of the words have the EE spelling pattern and some of them have the EA spelling pattern? They can take those words and instead of just rainbow writing them, they can copy them into subdivided lists because that requires thinking, right? They're not just, rotely copying the word, potentially not thinking about it. They're having to consider the phonics pattern, the spelling pattern that it contains when they're writing it into like, a 2-column list or whatever you're working on. So do your practice activities, go beyond memorization. And then the other question I ask myself is, am I incorporating frequent review? Because in like the traditional spelling test setup, which you may have had as a child, I had it as a child, I just got my list of words, I memorized it, practiced it during the week, and then after the test on Friday, we didn't come back to those words, right? It was just, okay, so you've learned them and, we're moving on. And the fact is that kids need to overlearn phonics patterns. They need more review than we may think to give them. And so having like a list of set list of words for each week and then just moving on, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to kids retaining that information. So I suggest that instead of asking ourselves, are spelling tests good and bad, we ask ourselves all of these questions about our spelling instruction. I believe that spelling instruction is necessary. There's so much that goes into it that also helps with the reading process too, right? Like phonics knowledge helps with the reading process. Morphology knowledge helps with the reading process. Even the memorization that spelling requires helps with the reading process. But if you are ever having a conversation with a colleague or an administrator about them, I think it's important to go beyond just are they good or bad and really think about what our instruction looks like, how we're choosing words for kids. Are we differentiating? Are we having them practice in ways that encourages them to think about what the words mean and the phonics patterns in the words? Are we teaching them to look for those spelling words in books, making connections? Are we encouraging them to transfer it to their writing? Are we encouraging them when they learn the OA spelling pattern, not just to spell those words that we're working on, but to also try out other words with the OA spelling pattern, so to generalize. All of these things help kids learn to spell words correctly. And so if we just stick to memorization, like many traditional spelling tests do, then that's not really going to accomplish our ultimate goal. So let me see if I have any questions before I wrap up here. Barbara. So Barbara says, are you for or against spelling tests? You must just be joining us, Barbara. I would say this is going to save to the page. Go and start at the beginning so that you can see, because my answer is a little bit complicated. I am for assessing children on their spelling ability. I believe it's really important to teach spelling and phonics. I believe it's essential. But are spelling tests good or bad? That question in itself it's almost like a loaded question, right? Because it all depends on the execution. So that's kind of my position on it. All right, well, if you are watching later, you think of questions later, feel free to add them in the comments. Again, I would love to hear what you think. I'd also be curious to know, do you have a spelling program at your school? Do you like it? And is there anything that you would change about it? I'm really curious because I know that schools tend to be different in the types of spelling programs that they use. Some schools don't use any spelling program at all. I've been at a school that did not, which I was not happy about, but I would love to hear about your specific situation. So feel free to continue the chat in the comments, and thank you so much for joining me.